A millionaire is carefully driving down a rainy road with his 8-month-old baby when nails intentionally scattered on the pavement puncture his tires, causing the car to skid and roll over violently. Injured and dazed, he manages to pull his frightened baby from the wreck before collapsing in the rain. That's when a 7-year-old homeless girl living in a nearby shack hears the crash and rushes to help. When she finds the unconscious man clutching his crying baby, she notices something about his face that makes her heart race. The rhythmic drumming of rain on the windshield hypnotized Edward Miller as he drove down the winding rural highway, his fingers tapping on the steering wheel, keeping time with nature's melody. At 42, the entrepreneur had learned to cherish these quiet moments, especially when his most precious treasure rode in the back seat. His 8-month-old son slept soundly in his car seat, oblivious to the intensifying storm outside. Edward adjusted the rearview mirror to observe the angelic face of his child. Those closed eyes and clenched fists, signaling complete trust, awakened a tenderness in him that few ever saw. Behind the facade of a ruthless millionaire businessman, there was a heart that melted completely for that helpless little creature. The visit to his relatives in the countryside had been postponed 3 times due to work, but today, nothing would prevent him from keeping the promise he made to his wife. The scent of damp earth permeated the car through the small gaps, bringing back memories of his own childhood in the sticks. Edward smiled, remembering running barefoot in the rain, never imagining that one day he'd be driving a luxury car down these same dirt roads. Fate, he thought, had a peculiar way of bringing you back to your roots as he slowed down, spotting a sharp curve ahead. His thoughts were abruptly interrupted by the unmistakable sound of a tire blowing out. Not one, but several tires simultaneously, creating a metallic, high-pitched shriek that made his heart pound. The steering wheel began to vibrate violently in his hands, and Edward realized with horror that he was losing complete control of the vehicle. The rain made the road slick, and the car began to skid dangerously towards the ditch. "No, no, no," he murmured, desperately trying to keep the car on the asphalt. His reflexes, honed by years of driving, battled against the relentless physics pushing him off the road. His baby woke with the sudden movement and began to cry, a sound that pierced Edward's soul like a sharp blade. The world seemed to slow down as the car flipped. Edward felt his body hurled against the seatbelt, glass shattering around him, metal twisting with deafening crashes. His only concern was the baby's desperate cries, echoing in the chaos like an urgent call for protection. When the car finally stopped rolling, Edward found himself upside down, trapped by his seatbelt. Blood trickled from a gash on his forehead. His vision was blurred, but he could perfectly hear his son's terrified screams. With a strength he didn't know he possessed, he managed to unbuckle himself and crawl to the baby's car seat. "Daddy's here, my love, Daddy's here," he whispered, his voice trembling, checking every tiny finger, every breath. Miraculously, the child appeared unharmed, just terribly frightened. Edward managed to get the baby out of the car seat and squeeze through the shattered window, shielding the child's head with his own body. The rain poured torrentially over them as Edward finally managed to stand outside the wrecked vehicle. His legs trembled, either from the shock of the accident or from injuries he hadn't yet assessed. The baby continued to cry in his arms, quickly getting drenched in the storm. Edward looked around, searching for help, but the road was completely deserted. The pain in his ribs intensified. His vision began to darken at the edges. He hugged his son tighter, determined to protect him until his last breath, but his strength was rapidly fading. "Someone, please," he murmured into the void before collapsing to his knees in the mud, still holding the baby firmly against his chest. The last thing he saw before losing consciousness were small, barefoot feet running towards him down the soaked road. Luna had just hung the last wet clothes on the makeshift clothesline when the crash echoed through the woods. At 7 years old, she already had ears trained to distinguish dangerous sounds from harmless ones, and that was definitely not the common rumble of a passing truck. It was something far worse. Leaving the dented aluminum basin on the ground, she ran to the windowless opening of the shack where she lived with her younger brother. The rain obscured her vision, but she managed to glimpse a dark shape on the road's curve, exactly where drivers always lost control in heavy rain. "Peter, stay inside!" she yelled to the 5-year-old boy, who was playing with scraps of wood in the corner of their single room. Peter looked up, startled, but obeyed without question. Luna had become his only protection since they were abandoned there, and he knew that when she used that tone of voice, it was best to listen. Luna slipped on her worn-out rubber flip-flops and ran out into the rain. Her brown hair matted to her face, but she didn't slow down. Something in her chest tightened, as if an inner voice whispered that someone desperately needed her help at that moment. When she got closer to this accident, her heart nearly stopped. A luxury car was completely destroyed, flipped over on the side of the road. Scattered glass glinted like dangerous diamonds in the rain. But what truly made her run even faster was the sight of a man kneeling in the mud, holding something small against his chest. "Sir, sir," she shouted, reaching the man. He was unconscious, blood trickling from his forehead, but his arms remained firmly wrapped around a baby who was crying desperately. Luna felt something familiar about that face, but the urgency of the situation didn't allow her to stop and think. The baby was soaked and shivering from the cold. Luna, with all the delicacy a 7-year-old child could muster, tried to wake the man by gently shaking his shoulder. When she realized he wouldn't respond anytime soon, she made a decision that would change all their lives. "It's okay, little baby," she whispered, running her wet hands through the child's fine hair. "Luna will take care of both of you." With surprising strength for her age and size, she managed to help the unconscious man lean on her. Each step back to the shack was a struggle against his weight, the mud, and the incessant rain. The baby cried even louder, as if sensing the desperation of the situation. Peter appeared at the door when he saw his sister approaching with 2 strangers. His eyes widened, but he immediately ran to help, holding open the plywood door so she could enter. "Peter, get the cleanest towels we have," Luna ordered, laying the man on the thin mattress that served as a bed for the 2 siblings. The baby continued to cry, and she realized she needed to act quickly to warm him. While Peter brought the driest rags he could find, Luna examined the injured man. He was breathing, but very pale. The wound on his forehead was bleeding but didn't seem fatal. What worried her most was the cold they were all feeling. She took the baby into her arms with all the care in the world. The little one calmed slightly, feeling the human warmth but still trembled violently. Luna used her own dry shirt to wrap him, even though it left her in just a thin t-shirt. "Sister, who are they?" Peter asked in a low voice, observing the strangers with curiosity mixed with fear. Luna looked again at the unconscious man's face. There was something in his features that stirred her memory, like a distant echo of something important. But now was not the time to try and remember. "I don't know, Peter, but they need our help," she replied, cradling the baby who was finally starting to quiet down. "And we're going to give them all the help we can." The rain continued to beat against the tin roof, creating a sound that could be comforting if circumstances were different. Luna looked at her temporary family, an injured man, a frightened baby and her little brother, and wondered how 3 children could care for so much need. The pre-dawn hours brought an unsettling silence. Luna had spent the entire night awake, alternating between caring for the baby and checking if the man was still breathing. Peter slept curled in a corner, using a thin blanket that barely passed for a rag, but it was all they had for warmth. The baby had finally fallen asleep in her arms after much crying, and after she managed to make an improvised bottle with expired powdered formula she kept for emergencies. Her back ached from sitting in the same position, but she didn't dare move and wake the little one. When the first rays of sun filtered through the cracks in the boards, Luna could finally observe the injured man's face better. He was younger than she had imagined in the darkness, perhaps around 40, with dark hair and stubble that gave him a less formal air. His clothes, even dirty with mud and blood, were clearly expensive. It was then that something clicked in her mind, like a puzzle piece fitting perfectly. Luna slowly got up, laid the baby on the mattress, and walked to an old tin can where she kept her few treasures. She rummaged through crumpled papers until she found what she was looking for, a newspaper clipping she had picked from the trash. A few weeks ago, on the front page, there was a photo of a man in a suit inaugurating a daycare for needy children. She compared the photo with the face of the sleeping man, and her heart pounded. It was him, the same man who, 3 months ago, had stopped his car on the corner where she was begging for money in the city. Luna remembered that day perfectly because it had been too special to forget. She had gone 2 days without eating anything but some spoiled fruit found in the market's trash. Peter was crying from hunger beside her, and she didn't know what else to do. That's when that gleaming black car stopped right in front of her. The man had rolled down the window and, instead of just giving some coins like others did, asked when they had last eaten a real meal. When Luna replied that she couldn't remember, he parked the car and walked to the nearest bakery. He returned with 2 bags full of bread, milk, fruit, and even some sweets. But what most impressed Luna wasn't the food. It was the way he knelt on the sidewalk, getting down to her eye level, and said softly, "You two deserve good things in life, okay? Never forget that." Those words echoed in her mind for days. No one had ever told her she deserved anything good. In fact, most people didn't even look at her when they passed by asking for help. But that man had seen her as a person worthy of kindness. I knew that face," she whispered, sitting back down beside the injured man. "You gave me bread and milk when I was so hungry." The man stirred slightly, as if her voice had reached him even in his unconscious state. Luna gently held his hand, feeling how cold it was. "Now it's my turn to take care of you," she murmured. "You were kind to me when no one else was. I'm going to repay that kindness no matter what happens." Peter woke at that moment, rubbing his eyes and looking confused at the scene. Luna signaled for him to stay quiet and approach slowly. "Peter, remember that man who gave us food in the city a few months ago? The one who was so nice to us?" Peter nodded, his eyes lighting up with the memory. "It's him, Peter. It's the same man. And now he needs our help just like we needed his that day." Peter looked at the injured man with an expression of recognition mixed with concern. Even being small, he perfectly understood the significance of that moment. The baby began to stir and make soft noises. Soon he would wake asking for food again, and Luna knew they would have to find a solution to feed him properly. But for now, knowing she was repaying an act of kindness gave her strength to face any difficulty that arose. Edward slowly opened his eyes, as if emerging from a deep, confused dream. The first thing he noticed was that he wasn't in his king-size bed with Egyptian cotton sheets, but on a thin mattress that smelled of dampness. The second was the throbbing, pain in his ribs, and the feeling of having cotton in his head. "The baby," was the first word he managed to murmur, trying to sit up quickly and immediately punished by overwhelming dizziness. "Take it easy, sir. Your baby is fine," a child's voice said beside him. Edward slowly turned his head and saw a skinny girl with disheveled brown hair, carefully holding a child he recognized as his son. He ate, and he's sleeping peacefully. Edward blinked several times, trying to understand where he was and how he had gotten there. The last fragment of memory he could recall was the terrible sound of tires blowing out and the feeling of losing control of the car. Everything after that was a dense, terrifying fog. Where am I?" he asked, trying to sit up again, this time more carefully. "In my shack, sir. You had an accident on the road and I brought both of you here," Luna explained, approaching to help him get into a more comfortable position. "My name is Luna, and that's my brother Peter." Edward looked around and felt his heart ache. The room was tiny, with plywood walls, a dirt floor, and furniture that had clearly been scavenged. But it was clean, organized, and there was an evident care in how each object was placed. You're just a child," he murmured, still processing the situation. "How did you manage to bring me here?" Luna gave a shy but proud smile. "You learn to be strong when you have to, right, sir? And you're not that heavy." It was then that something in her expression sparked a vague memory in Edward's mind. Those large, expressive eyes, that way of speaking. He had seen that face before, he was sure. I know you," he said slowly, studying the girl's features. Luna lowered her eyes, suddenly shy. "You gave me food in the city a few months ago. You stopped your car on the corner where I was begging and bought bread and milk for me and Peter." The memory came back like a punch to the gut. Edward remembered that day perfectly. He was returning from a particularly stressful meeting when he saw the two children on the sidewalk. Something in their silent desperation made him stop, even though he was late for another engagement. "My God," he whispered, feeling his eyes fill with tears. You saved me. After everything you've been through, you saved me." "You were kind to me when no one else was," Luna replied simply. "Now it was my turn to be kind to you." Edward reached out a trembling hand to touch the girl's face, but stopped midway, realizing how dirty and bruised his own hands were. "How did you know it was me?" "I found a newspaper that talked about you," she said, showing him the crumpled piece of paper. "But I already knew. I never forgot your face. You said I deserved good things in life. No one had ever told me that." Tears finally escaped Edward's eyes. Here he was, a man who considered himself strong and independent, being cared for by a child living in conditions he could barely imagine, and she did it not out of obligation or for reward, but simply out of gratitude. "Luna," he said, his voice choked with emotion, "you saved my son's life. How can I thank you for this?" "You don't need to thank me, sir. We take care of each other when we can, right?" Peter timidly approached, carrying an aluminum mug with water. "For you to drink," he said in a small voice. Edward took the mug and drank the warm water, which to him at that moment tasted like the purest drink in the world. When he finished, he looked at the two children and felt something changing deeply within his chest. "How long have you two been living here alone?" he asked softly. "About 2 years," Luna replied, "since our parents left." Edward closed his eyes for a moment, trying to process the magnitude of that situation. 2 children, alone, surviving, the best way they could, and still finding the strength to save strangers. The following days brought a routine Edward never imagined he'd experience. Luna had become a dedicated little nurse, changing the makeshift bandages on his forehead with clean cloths and checking his temperature with the palm of her hand. Peter, for his part, had taken on the role of entertaining the baby, making funny faces and humming made-up lullabies. Edward observed everything with a mixture of admiration and guilt that grew by the hour. How could 2 children demonstrate such maturity and care? And why was he, a man who prided himself on knowing the world, discovering life lessons through 2 abandoned children? "Luna," he said one afternoon when he felt stronger, "tell me about yourselves. How did you end up here?" The girl was mending a tear in the only cloth doll she owned, using frayed thread from a burlap sack. She stopped her work and looked at Peter, who was playing with the baby on the floor. Our dad worked for a big company in the city, she began, her voice low so as not to scare her brother. He was a hard worker, always came home late, but he always brought us something nice. Our mom would get sick sometimes, but she was loving. Edward realized she was speaking in the past tense and felt a pang in his chest. What happened? He asked gently. One day, Dad came home crying. He said he'd been fired, that they said he'd done something wrong. But he hadn't. Mum got really upset and started screaming. They fought a lot that night. Luna stopped sewing and looked out the window as if she could see the past projected onto the landscape outside. After that, Dad started drinking a lot. Mum cried every day. They fought all the time, saying they didn't have money to take care of us. One day, Dad left and never came back. A week later, Mum also left. She left a note saying she was going to look for work somewhere else and would come back for us. How long ago was that? Edward could barely get the question out. 2 years and 3 months, Peter suddenly replied, without taking his eyes off the baby. Luna taught me how to count the days on the clinic calendar. Edward felt as if he'd been punched in the stomach. 2 children, abandoned by their own parents, surviving alone for over 2 years. And yet, they had enough generosity in their hearts to save strangers. How do you get food? How do you survive? We scavenge for recyclables, Luna explained, resuming her sewing. Paper, cans, glass. There's a man in town who buys from us. It's not much money, but it's enough for rice, beans, stuff like that, and sometimes people throw out perfectly good food. Edward closed his eyes, trying to process that reality. While he worried about quarterly reports and stock market investments, these 2 children fought daily just to avoid starvation. And when you get sick, we take care of ourselves as best we can, Luna said, shrugging. There's a community clinic in town, but it's far, and sometimes they ask too many questions about where our parents are. Are you afraid they'll separate you? Edward already knew the answer before he even asked. Luna's eyes filled with tears that she fought to hold back. So scared, sir. Peter is all I have, and I'm all he has. If they separate us... She couldn't finish the sentence, but Edward understood perfectly. Those 2 children had created their own family, based on love, and the mutual need for survival. Luna, he said, his voice heavy with emotion, you 2 won't be separated. I promise you that. How can you promise that, sir? She asked, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Edward looked at the baby sleeping peacefully in Peter's arms, then at the 2 children who had become his saviors and in some inexplicable way, his temporary family. Because, he said, making a decision that would change all their lives, you won't be alone ever again. One way or another, I'll make sure you have a real family. For the first time since he'd known her, Luna smiled a true, hopeful smile. On the 5th day after the accident, Luna was hanging improvised diapers on the clothesline when she noticed something strange. A black car had passed by the road 3 times in less than an hour, always slowing down at the curve where the accident happened. Her survival instincts, sharpened by years of living on the streets, triggered a silent alarm in her mind. Peter, she called softly, trying not to show nervousness. Come inside. The boy immediately obeyed, recognizing the tone of voice his sister used when she sensed danger. Edward, who was sitting on the mattress feeding the baby an improvised bottle Luna had traded for some cans, noticed the tension in the air. What is it, Luna? He asked, his own business experience having taught him to read alarm signals in others. There's a car passing by the road too many times. It's not normal, she explained, peeking through a crack in the wall. People only pass here when they're going to or from town. No one drives around for no reason. Edward felt a chill down his spine. In his years of business, he had learned that accidents rarely happened by chance when a lot of money was involved. And he was involved with a lot of money. What kind of car? He asked, trying to keep his voice calm so as not to scare the children. Black, big, with tinted windows. Looks like a rich person's car, Luna replied, still observing through the crack. Edward shifted the baby and began to think rapidly. Who would know he had traveled down that specific road? Few people knew his plans to visit relatives. His assistant, his wife, who was traveling, and... My God, he murmured, a terrible suspicion beginning to form in his mind. What is it, sir? Peter approached, sensing the change in the man's tone of voice. Luna, you said you found nails on the road when you went to get pieces of my car. Yes, sir. They were all scattered, like someone had thrown them on purpose. I thought it was strange, because truck drivers are always careful not to drop cargo. Like that? Edward's suspicion turned into cold, frightening certainty. This hadn't been an accident. Someone had carefully planned his death, using information about his route to set a deadly trap. Luna, Peter, he said, his voice taking on a tone of controlled urgency. Do you know anywhere we can hide? A place where no one could find us? The girl's eyes widened. Are you in danger, sir? We are in danger, he corrected. If those people in the car are looking for me and they find out you helped me... He didn't need to finish the sentence. Luna perfectly understood the implication. Dangerous people didn't leave witnesses. There's a place, she said after a moment of intense reflection. Peter and I dug a hole under the house when we first got here. It was to hide from storms, but it's big enough for all of us. Show me, Edward requested, picking up the baby. Luna lifted a loose board in the corner of the shack, revealing an opening that led to an underground space. It was small, but dry, and there were even some candles stored there. We made it thinking about really bad rainy days, Peter explained proudly. No one can see it from the road. Edward looked at the hiding place, and then at the two children who had prepared for emergencies with a wisdom many adults didn't possess. Once again, they surprised him with their survival skills. The sound of an approaching engine made everyone freeze. Luna approached the crack again, and her face paled. They stopped, she whispered. 2 men are getting out of the car. They're looking over here. Edward didn't hesitate. Get down, now. They quickly descended into the underground shelter. Luna replaced the board, leaving only a small gap for air. In the cramped space, Edward held the baby close to his chest, praying he wouldn't start crying. Heavy footsteps approached the shack. Male voices conversed in low, urgent tones. You sure this is it? The tire marks led in this direction. If anyone survived, it had to be close by. Edward closed his eyes, hugging his son even tighter. Luna held Peter's hand, and everyone remained in absolute silence, united by fear and the mutual need for protection. Upstairs, the footsteps circled. The shack, searching for signs of life. The men remained in the shack for almost an hour, searching every corner of the small room. Edward could hear their muffled voices through the board, discussing where else to look. The baby had fallen asleep in his arms, but Edward knew that at any moment he could wake up and cry, giving away their location. Finally, the footsteps moved away, and the sound of the engine disappeared in the distance. Even so, Luna gestured for them to remain silent for a few more minutes. When they finally emerged from the hiding place, everyone breathed a sigh of relief, but the feeling of safety had vanished forever. They'll be back, Luna said, reorganizing the things the men had rummaged through. People like that always come back. Edward knew she was right. He sat on the mattress with the baby and watched the 2 children who had become his only allies in a situation that was growing increasingly dangerous. Luna, Peter, he began, his voice carrying a gravity they had never heard before. I need to tell you something. You deserve to know the truth. The children approached, sitting on the dirt floor in front of him like students awaiting an important lesson. My full name is Edward Miller. I own a very large company, And that means I also have enemies. People who want to harm me to take what's mine." Luna frowned. "You think that's why the accident happened?" "I'm certain," Edward replied. "Someone scattered nails on the road knowing I would pass there. Someone who knows my schedule, my plans, someone I trust." The words came out bitterly. Betrayal was always the hardest wound to heal, and knowing that someone close had planned his death was more painful than any physical injury. "But why?" Peter asked, his eyes confused. "Why would someone want to hurt you if you're a good person?" Edward smiled sadly. "Sometimes, Peter, people do bad things for money, and I have a lot of money." Luna, with her precocious wisdom developed by a hard life, immediately understood the situation. "If those people find out you're alive, they'll try to hurt you again. And you too, Edward added, the cruel reality of the situation weighing on all of them. "By helping me, you're now in danger as well." The silence that followed was heavy and frightening. Luna looked at Peter, then at the sleeping baby, and Edward could see the weight of responsibility descending on her small shoulders. "We could leave," she suggested hesitantly. "Leave you here and go somewhere else, far from here." "No!" Edward's response was immediate and firm. "You saved my life and my son's life. I'm not abandoning you now. But if we stay, everyone will be in danger," Peter said, demonstrating an understanding of the situation that broke Edward's heart. Edward looked at the two children, one 7 and one 5, who were discussing survival strategies like experienced generals. The injustice of that situation struck him like lightning. "Listen closely, both of you," he said, his voice taking on a tone of iron determination. "No one is going to hurt you. No one is going to separate us. And no one is going to get what they want at the expense of our family." "Our family?" Luna's eyes lit up at the word. "Yes," Edward confirmed, realizing he had spoken from the heart. "You are my family now, and families protect each other, no matter what happens." Luna approached, and for the first time since they met, hugged Edward. Peter soon joined the hug, and the four of them, including the baby who slept peacefully, formed a circle of mutual protection. "So what are we going to do?" Luna asked, her voice muffled against Edward's chest. Edward looked out the window, seeing the road where it had all begun. An idea began to form in his mind. Dangerous, but perhaps his only chance to discover who was trying to destroy him and protect his new family at the same time. "We're going to do what they least expect," he said, a determined smile appearing on his bruised face. "We're going to hunt the hunters." The next morning, Edward woke with a determination he hadn't felt in days. His head was clearer, the pain in his ribs had lessened, and he knew it was time to take concrete action. But first, he needed information. "Luna," he called softly, as the girl prepared oatmeal for the baby. "You said you went back to the accident site to get things from my car. Was the car still there?" Luna stopped stirring the oatmeal and looked at him with a worried expression. "That's the strange part, Mr. Edward. On the first day, I went back to see if I could find anything useful. The car was all smashed up on the side of the road, but on the second day, when I went back again, it was gone." "Gone?" Edward felt a shiver run down his spine. "What do you mean, gone?" "Disappeared, like it was never there. Even the pieces of glass had been swept away." Peter approached, confirming his sister's words. "It was really weird. We thought maybe the police had taken it, but there were no sirens, no noisy tow truck." Edward began to pace the small room, his business brain rapidly processing the information. Removing a wrecked car without making a sound during the night wasn't the work of ordinary people. It was the work of professionals. "Someone doesn't want there to be evidence of the accident," he murmured, more to himself than to the children. "Mr. Edward," Luna said hesitantly, "there's something else I found strange." She went to the tin can where she kept her treasures and pulled out some crumpled papers. Edward immediately recognized them. They were documents for his car that had been scattered during the accident. When I picked these up, there was more paper. There were some sheets with numbers and people's names. But when I went back on the second day to get more things, only these papers were left. The others were gone. Edward took the documents and examined them carefully. They were just bureaucratic papers, car registration, insurance, some invoices, nothing important. But the papers that had disappeared, those could be dangerous. Luna, do you remember any name that was on those papers that disappeared? The girl closed her eyes, concentrating. Her memory, trained by the need to remember where to find food and shelter, was impressively precise. There was one name that appeared a lot, Robert something, and there were big numbers like money. Edward's blood ran cold. Robert Stanton, his partner for over 10 years, the man he trusted most in the business world. The disappeared documents were probably financial reports Edward always carried to analyze during trips. "My God," he whispered, sitting heavily on the mattress. "Robert, you know this man?" Luna asked, noticing the drastic change in Edward's behavior. "I do," he replied, his voice filled with deep bitterness. "He's my partner, my friend for over 10 years, the man who is my son's godfather." The baby, as if sensing the tension in the air, began to cry. Peter immediately picked him up and started making the funny faces that always worked to calm him. Edward watched the scene, a 5-year-old child taking care of his son with more affection than many adults would show, and felt an explosive mixture of gratitude and rage. "Why would he do that?" Luna asked, sitting next to Edward. "Why would a friend try to hurt you?" "Greed," Edward replied simply. "Our company is worth a lot of money, Luna, and if I died in the accident, Robert would get everything." But what about your baby? Wouldn't he inherit his dad's things?" Edward smiled sadly at the innocence of the question. "My son is too young. If something happened to me, Robert would be responsible for managing the business until he grew up. And in 10-15 years, a lot can disappear." Peter stopped making faces at the baby and looked seriously at Edward. "So this Robert is a very bad person." "Very bad," Edward confirmed, "and very dangerous. He has enough money to hire bad people to do bad things." Luna remained silent for a few minutes, processing all the information. When she spoke again, her voice had a determination Edward was already learning to recognize and respect. "Mr. Edward, if this man sent people to look for you, he'll send more people, and next time, they might not leave just because they didn't find anything." Edward knew she was right. Robert wasn't the type to give up easily. If he had planned an assassination, he wouldn't rest until he was sure it had worked. "So," Edward said, looking at his 3 companions, 2 children and a baby who had become his most loyal family, "we're going to give him exactly what he wants." 3 days later, the apparent tranquility was brutally interrupted. Luna was returning from the creek where she washed clothes when she saw a white van parked on the road. It wasn't the same black car as before, but her instincts immediately triggered alarm signals. She hid behind a tree and observed. 2 men in suits got out of the van, but these were different from the previous ones. They wore badges and carried clipboards. They looked more official. One of them was talking on the phone while the other took pictures of the area. "Yes, sir," the man on the phone said, his voice carrying on the breeze. "We received a tip about 2 children living in precarious conditions in this area. We'll investigate and, if necessary, take them to appropriate shelters." Luna's heart almost stopped. Child Protective Services. They had come to take her and Peter, but who had made the report, and why now? She ran back to the shack, trying to stay calm so as not to arouse suspicion if someone was watching her. When she arrived, She found Edward teaching Peter how to change the baby's diaper, a scene that in other circumstances would have made her smile. "Mr. Edward," she whispered urgently, "there are government people looking for me and Peter." Edward immediately became alert. "What do you mean?" Luna quickly recounted what she had seen and heard. Edward listened in silence, his face growing darker and darker. "They're not from the government," he finally said. "Robert is using the official system to find us. He knows if you disappear, I'll show up looking for you." "But how did he know about us?" Peter asked, stopping his play with the baby. Edward thought quickly. He must have investigated who lives in this area. 2 orphaned children are the perfect target. No one will question it much if they disappear. Luna felt a cold fear spread through her chest. For 2 years, she and Peter had managed to remain invisible, off official radars. Now, because they had helped Edward, they were being hunted. "We have to get out of here," she said, already starting to gather their few possessions. "If they get here—" "No!" Edward interrupted, his voice firm. "If you run now, you'll spend the rest of your lives running. Robert won't stop looking until he's sure he's eliminated all witnesses." "So what do we do?" Peter was scared but tried to be brave. Edward picked up the baby and walked to the window, observing the road where the van was still parked. His business mind worked frantically, calculating risks and opportunities. "We'll use Robert's own strategy against him," he finally said. "He wants you to disappear, then you will disappear, but not the way he expects." Luna frowned. "I don't understand." "Robert is counting on the fact that I'll show up to save you if something happens." "He's right, I would. But what if I'm already with you when something happens?" Luna's eyes lit up with understanding. "You want them to catch us, but with you too?" "Exactly. If I appear as a third adult trying to protect you, I'll just look like a good Samaritan helping children in distress. Robert will never imagine that I survived the accident and have been here all along." Peter looked confused at the two. "But isn't that dangerous?" "Very dangerous," Edward admitted. "But staying hidden here is also dangerous, and running away is even more dangerous. At least this way, we'll force Robert to show his hand." Luna walked to the window and watched the men who were still photographing the area. "What if it goes wrong?" Edward approached her and placed a hand on the girl's shoulder. "Luna, you've spent 2 years protecting Peter. I've seen how smart you are, how you can read people and situations. I trust you." "And I trust you, sir," she replied, looking directly into Edward's eyes. "But if we do this, we need a plan for everything that can go wrong." "We always do," Edward said, smiling for the first time in days. "That's what families are for, to plan together and protect each other." The sound of car doors closing made everyone look out the window again. The men were putting away their cameras and preparing to leave, but Edward knew they would return soon, probably with more people and official warrants. "How much time do you think we have?" he asked. Luna thought for a moment. "If they're really from the government, they'll need papers, authorization, all that stuff. Maybe a day or 2. "Perfect," Edward said, his tone taking on the determination of a general preparing for battle. "Then we have 2 days to prepare a surprise Robert will never forget." The next morning, Edward woke to the sound of violent coughing coming from the corner of the shack where Peter was sleeping. The cough was dry, harsh, and accompanied by labored breathing that made his heart pound with worry. Luna was already awake, sitting beside her brother, stroking his forehead with a barely disguised look of panic. When Edward approached, she looked at him with tear-filled eyes. "He's very hot, Mr. Edward, and he can't stop coughing," she whispered, trying not to show the desperation in her voice so as not to scare Peter even more. Edward touched the boy's forehead and immediately felt the high fever. Peter trembled under the thin blanket. alternating between chills and excessive sweating. His breathing was rapid and shallow, and he seemed to have difficulty swallowing. "How long has he been like this?" Edward asked, checking for any rash on the boy's skin. "It started during the night. At first it was just a little cough, but it got worse quickly," Luna explained, wiping sweat from her brother's forehead with a damp cloth. "He said his throat hurts a lot." Edward observed the boy, who had always been so cheerful and playful, now frail and clearly suffering. Guilt hit him like a punch to the gut. If it weren't for him, the children wouldn't be in this dangerous situation. If it weren't for him, Peter could be receiving proper medical care instead of being sick in an unheated shack. "We need to take him to the hospital," Luna said, her voice beginning to crack. "He's never been this sick. I don't know what to do." Edward knew she was right, but he also knew that was exactly what Robert was waiting for. An emergency that would force them out of hiding and expose themselves. "Luna," he said gently, "you know that if we take Peter to the hospital, people will ask questions. They'll want to know where you live, where your parents are." "I don't care!" she burst out, all her defenses crumbling at once. "They can take me wherever they want. They can separate me from Peter, but he needs a doctor now." Tears streamed down the girl's face, and Edward realized he had reached the cruelest moment of the situation. Luna was being forced to choose between Peter's safety and the safety of all of them. Peter, even with a fever, perceived his sister's desperation. In a weak, hoarse voice, he whispered, "Luna, don't cry. I'll be okay." "No, Peter," she sobbed. "You're very sick, and it's my fault for bringing you into this situation." Edward could no longer bear to see the suffering of the two, people who had become more important to him than any business or fortune. He picked up the baby, who slept peacefully, oblivious to the drama around him, and made a decision that would change everything. "We're taking Peter to the hospital," he said firmly. "All of us, together." Luna raised her red-rimmed eyes. "But Mr. Edward, if they find out who you are, then they will," he interrupted. "Peter is more important than any plan, any strategy. He is a sick child who needs help, and we are his family. Families don't abandon each other, no matter the risk." Luna looked at him with an expression of gratitude mixed with fear. What if it's a trap? What if Robert is expecting exactly this? Edward knelt beside Peter, running his hand through the boy's sweaty hair. "Then we will face that trap head on, but we won't let fear stop us from taking care of those we love." Peter opened his feverish eyes and looked at Edward. "Mr. Edward, you won't let them separate me and Luna, will you?" "Never," Edward promised, his voice filled with an iron determination. "You have my word." Luna began to gather their few belongings, her hands trembling with nervousness and fear. "How will we get to the hospital? It's too far to walk, and Peter can barely stand." Edward looked out the window, mentally calculating the distance and available options. "We'll flag down the first car that passes and ask for help. If someone sees a clearly sick child, they won't refuse assistance." "What if it's someone working for Robert?" "Then," Edward said, picking Peter up gently, "we'll find out once and for all who our enemies and our friends are." As they left the shack towards the road, Edward knew there was no turning back. Whatever the outcome of that day, their lives would never be the same. The first car that stopped was driven by an elderly lady who, upon seeing Peter in Edward's arms, clearly in a feverish state, didn't hesitate for a second to help. During the drive to the hospital, Edward observed every movement on the road, every car that followed them, prepared for any sign of danger. At the hospital, Peter was immediately attended to by the doctors. The diagnosis was pneumonia, but fortunately treatable with proper medication. While the boy received IV fluids and antibiotics, Edward remained in the hallway with Luna and the baby, all tense and alert. That's when she appeared, a real social worker this time, with official identification and forms to fill out. Edward knew this moment would define everything. "Sir, I need to ask you some questions about the children," the woman said, a middle-aged lady with a kind but professional expression. "Are you related to them?" "No," Edward replied honestly. "I found them living alone in a difficult situation, and I'm trying to help." "And where exactly were they living?" Edward described the shack without lying, explaining how he had discovered the children were abandoned. The social worker made notes, but something in her expression changed when she heard the details. "Sir," she said, lowering her voice and looking around nervously, "I need to tell you something. Yesterday we received an anonymous tip about 2 children living at that exact location. The tip came with a substantial donation to our institution, specifically to properly care for these children." Edward felt his blood run cold. "A donation? 100,000, sir, with very specific instructions on how the children should be separated. The girl to a shelter in another state, the boy to a different institution. I thought it was very strange for someone to be so specific about children they supposedly didn't even know." Luna, who was listening to the conversation, clutched Edward's arm. She had perfectly understood what that meant. "Mr. Edward," she whispered, "they really want to separate us." Edward looked at the social worker, making a decision that would change everything. "Ma'am, I need to be completely honest with you. My name is Edward Miller, and someone is trying to harm me using these children." The woman's eyes widened. "Edward Miller, the businessman? But didn't you die in a car accident?" "I was supposed to," Edward confirmed. "But these 2 children saved my life and my baby's, and now the person who tried to kill me wants to use the official system to hurt them." The social worker looked at Luna, then at Edward, processing that. "The real information. This is very serious, Mr. Miller. If what you're saying is true—" "I can prove it," Edward interrupted. "I have documents, I can make calls, but I need your help to protect these children." At that moment, Peter appeared at the door of the room, still pale but clearly better, with a doctor beside him. "How are you feeling, champ?" Edward asked, kneeling to be at the boy's height. "Better," Peter replied with a weak smile. "The doctor said I'll be fine if I take my medicine properly." The doctor approached the adults. "The boy will make a full recovery, but needs constant care for the next few days. Are you able to provide that?" Edward looked at the social worker, who was still processing all the revelations. "Ma'am, I know it's a lot to absorb at once, but these children cannot be separated. They are everything to each other, and I commit to caring for all 3 of them as a family." "Mr. Miller," she said slowly, "if your allegations are confirmed, this becomes a matter of national security. Someone tried to assassinate a prominent businessman and is using our system to persecute innocent witnesses." Luna approached the woman with all the courage she could muster. "Ma'am, I know we don't have papers, we don't have a registered family, but Mr. Edward is a good person. He took care of us when we took care of him. We are a family now." The social worker looked at that improbable group, a millionaire businessman, 2 orphaned children and a baby, and saw something she rarely found in her work: true love and mutual protection. "I'll need to make some calls," she finally said, "but until we resolve this officially, you can stay together under my temporary supervision." Edward sighed with relief, but he knew the battle was just beginning. Robert would soon discover that his plan had failed, and when that happened, he would certainly resort to more desperate measures. "Thank you," he said to the social worker. "You don't know how much this means to our family." For the first time since the accident, Edward allowed himself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, they could win this war. During the next 2 days, while Peter recovered in a private hospital room that Edward had discreetly arranged, the social worker, who introduced herself as Ms. Marina, worked tirelessly to verify all of Edward's claims. Her calls confirmed his identity and the existence of suspicious irregularities involving Robert Stanton. It was on the 3rd Night that everything fell apart. Edward was sleeping in a chair beside Peter's bed when Luna woke him by gently shaking his shoulder. She was pale, and her eyes showed the fear he had learned to recognize. "Mr. Edward," she whispered, "there are strange men in the hallway. They're asking about admitted children and saying they're family." Edward immediately stood up and looked through the small window in the door. Two men in suits were talking to a nurse at the information desk. Even from a distance, he recognized the type. Contracted professionals, not police or official personnel. "Is Ms. Marina here?" he asked quickly. "She went home an hour ago. She said she'd be back in the morning with more papers." Edward looked at Peter, who was sleeping peacefully for the first time in days, then at the baby in the improvised bassinet the nurses had provided. His mind raced, calculating options. "Luna, do you know other exits from this hospital?" "I do," she replied, immediately. "When we sometimes came to bring recyclable materials to the cleaning crew, they showed us the back routes." Edward made a quick decision. "Wake Peter carefully. We're getting out of here." As Luna gently woke her brother, Edward quickly gathered their few belongings and picked up the baby. Peter was still weak, but could walk with help. They left the room silently and followed Luna through the less crowded corridors of the hospital. The girl knew every corner of that place, a result of years wandering through all the public places in the city in search of shelter or food. They reached the back exit undetected, but it was there that Edward realized they had fallen into a much larger trap than he had imagined. A black car was parked exactly at the exit they had chosen, and from the car stepped a man Edward knew very well, Robert Stanton himself. "Edward, my old friend," Robert said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You can't imagine the scare you gave me. When I heard you had survived, I almost didn't believe it." Edward instinctively placed himself in front of the children, holding the baby firmly against his chest. "Robert, so it was you all along?" "Of course it was me," Robert replied, approaching with calm, calculated steps. "You've always been too naive, Edward, too trusting. Our company is worth $200 million, and you really thought I'd be content with just half forever." "We were friends," Edward said, his voice heavy with pain and betrayal. "We were. And partners," Robert corrected, "and partners sometimes need to resolve disagreements, definitively." It was then that Luna did something that surprised everyone. She took a step forward, placing herself partially between Edward and Robert, and spoke with a courage that defied her young age. "Sir, are you Robert Stanton?" Robert looked at the girl with an expression of curiosity mixed with disdain. "I am. And you're one of the little witnesses who's been causing so much trouble." "I know you, sir," Luna said, her voice gaining strength. "Not personally, but I know your story." Edward looked at her in surprise. How could she know Robert? "My dad worked for your company," Luna continued, each word clear and determined. "Charles Albert Smith. Do you remember him?" Robert's face changed instantly, his confident smile vanishing completely. "He was fired 3 years ago for allegedly stealing money from the company," Luna continued, tears beginning to stream down her face. "But he didn't steal anything. You fabricated that story to get rid of him because he had discovered you were embezzling from the company." Edward felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. The connection between Robert, the children, and the whole situation was much deeper than he had imagined. "My dad died of a broken heart 6 months later," Luna said, her voice now trembling with contained emotion. "My mom grew distraught from crying so much, and we were left alone because you destroyed our family." Robert had gone completely pale. That's not possible." "It is too," Peter affirmed, who until then had remained silent, leaning on Edward. "Luna told me Dad's story many times. She remembers everything." Edward looked at Luna with even greater admiration. She hadn't just physically saved his life. She had chosen to save him, knowing exactly who his true enemy was. "You knew," he said softly. "You always knew who Robert was." "I knew from the moment I saw his name on those papers," Luna confirmed. "But Mr. Edward is a good person, and good people don't deserve to be hurt by bad people, even when those bad people have hurt us before." Robert, realizing that his psychological advantage had completely vanished, changed his strategy. Robert, realizing he had completely lost control of the situation, pulled a phone from his pocket. "This changes nothing," he said, trying to regain his composure. "You know too much, and people who know too much are bad for business." But before he could make any calls, the sound of sirens began to echo in the distance, growing louder and louder. Robert looked around, confused and clearly nervous. "Surprised?" a familiar female voice said. Ms. Marina appeared from behind a parked ambulance, accompanied by 2 FBI agents. "Mr. Stanton, you're under arrest for attempted murder, public corruption, and corporate fraud." Robert went livid. How did you know I'd be here?" Edward smiled for the first time in days. "Because we told them. Miss Marina didn't go home, Robert. She stayed here all night, waiting for you to show up." "But how did you know I would come?" It was Luna who answered, her voice small but firm. "Because you're just like my dad said you were, someone who can't leave things unfinished. You wouldn't rest until you saw with your own eyes that we had disappeared." Ms. Marina approached the group. "The calls I made confirmed everything. Mr. Miller, we found evidence that Robert has been embezzling money from the company for years. Your father was right, Luna. He had discovered the scheme and was eliminated to prevent him from reporting it." As the agents placed handcuffs on Robert, he looked at Edward with a mixture of rage and despair. "You have no idea what you're doing, Edward. Our company will go bankrupt without me. You'll lose everything." "Perhaps," Edward replied calmly, putting his arm around Luna and Peter's shoulders. "But I've already gained something much more valuable than any company. I've gained a family." Robert was led away by the agents, but before getting into the squad car, he shouted one last threat. "This isn't over, Edward. You'll regret it." Ms. Marina approached the children. "And you two? How are you feeling?" Peter looked at the woman with his eyes still a little tired from his illness, but shining with relief. "We're okay. Now we have a real family." Edward knelt to be at the children's height. "Luna, Peter, I have a very important question to ask you." The children looked at him with full attention. "Would you like me to officially be your dad? Would you like to have my last name, to live in my house, to never worry about food or shelter again?" Luna's eyes filled with tears of happiness. "Really, Mr. Edward, you really want to be our dad?" "More than anything in the world," he replied, his voice choked with emotion. "You saved me from much more than just an accident. You taught me what truly matters in life." Peter jumped into Edward's arms. "So that means we'll be the baby's siblings too?" "Exactly," Edward confirmed, hugging the 2 children and the baby at once. "You 3 will be siblings forever." Ms. Marina observed the scene with a warm smile. "Well, I have a lot of paperwork to do, but I believe I can expedite the adoption process, especially considering the extraordinary circumstances of this situation." Edward looked at the children, who had completely changed his life. "There's one thing I want to do first, before any official paperwork." "What?" Luna and Peter asked in unison. "I want to go back to that shack where you saved me. I want to turn that place into a memorial for your father, Luna. And I want to build a community center there to help other children who are going through what you went through." Luna began to cry from emotion. "Mr. Edward, Dad," he corrected gently. "And that's what families do. They honor the past and build a better future together." When they finally left the hospital, it was dawn. The sun rose golden on the horizon, illuminating the faces of the four people who had become a family through adversity, courage, and unconditional love. Edward knew there would still be challenges ahead. Legal issues, adaptation, the rebuilding of his company. But for the first time in his life, he truly understood that real wealth wasn't measured in money, but in the bonds formed when brave people decide to care for one another, regardless of the circumstances. 5 weeks after that rainy Sunday afternoon that changed all their lives, Edward parked his new car, a simpler, safer model, in front of what was once a dilapidated shack on the side of the road. In place of the improvised structure, there now stood a small but welcoming community center, with signs indicating Charles Albert Smith Memorial, Family Support Center. Luna got out of the car, holding Peter's hand firmly. He had fully recovered from pneumonia and now wore new clothes, but still maintained his characteristic mischievous grin. Edward carried the baby, who was already beginning to recognize his older siblings and always smiled when he saw them. "Dad," Luna said, using the title that still moved her every time she pronounced it, "it's even more beautiful than I imagined." The transformation was impressive. Where before there had been plywood and rusted tin, there were now colorful walls with paintings made by the community's own children. Where before there had been a dirt floor, now a clean, heated floor welcomed families in temporary need. Where before there had been only survival, now there was hope. Ms. Marina waited for them at the entrance, holding a folder with the final adoption documents. "Miller Smith family," she said with a warm smile. "The official papers arrived this morning. Luna and Peter are now legally your children, Edward." Peter ran to hug Edward. "Now I can call you Dad at school too." "Not only can you, but you should," Edward replied, picking up the boy. "And you can tell everyone you have the most beautiful little brother in the world." The baby, as if understanding he was being praised, clapped his hands and laughed, making everyone laugh along. They entered the community center where a small ceremony awaited them. Several local families were present, people Edward had met during the weeks of the project's construction and who had become part of his community support network. In the center of the main hall, there was a framed photograph of Charles Albert Smith, Luna and Peter's father. Edward had managed to find the photo through old company records and had it lovingly enlarged. Luna approached the portrait and gently touched the glass. "Hi, Dad," she whispered. "I have a new family now, but I'll never forget you. And look, now other children won't go through what we did." Peter joined his sister. "Dad said you were a very good man, and that good people never truly die when others remember their kindness." Edward was moved to see how the children had processed both loss and gain in such a healthy way. In just 5 weeks, they had learned that it was possible to honor the past while building a better future. During the ceremony, Edward gave a short but emotional speech. "This place was born from a tragedy, but it was transformed by the love and courage of 2 extraordinary children who taught me that true wealth lies in caring for each other." Luna, now wearing a new dress, but still with the same determination in her eyes, asked to speak. With a clear, firm voice, she said, "My dad always said that when someone does something good for you, you have to do good things for other people. Dad did much more than good things. He gave us a family. Now it's our turn to help other families stay together and be happy." The audience applauded emotionally, but Edward knew the real prize was right beside him. 3 children who had become his reason for living. When the ceremony ended and everyone left, the family remained alone in the community center. Edward looked around, seeing organized toys, books on shelves, clean beds for emergencies, a kitchen equipped to prepare nutritious meals. "Dad," Peter said, tugging at Edward's pants, "can I ask a question?" "Of course, son." What's going to happen to that bad man who tried to hurt us?" Edward knelt to be at the boy's height. "Robert will be in prison for many years, Peter, and our company will now be used to do good things, like this center and many other projects that will help families." Luna approached, carrying the baby she had picked up. "Dad, I have something for you." She pulled a folded paper from her pocket. It was the same crumpled newspaper clipping where she had first recognized Edward. "I don't need to keep this anymore," she said, "because now I have a real dad, not just a picture from the newspaper." Edward took the paper with trembling hands, remembering how it all began. "You know what we'll do with this? We'll frame it and put it here in the center, as a reminder that sometimes the most important encounters in our lives happen when we least expect them." As they left the community center, the sun was setting, painting the sky with golden and pink hues. Edward held Luna's hand, who held Peter's hand, who carried a bag with the baby's toys. They walked to the car like a human chain of love and mutual protection. "Dad," Luna said, as Edward adjusted the baby in his car seat, "thank you for saving us." Edward stopped and looked at her with a smile full of gratitude. "Luna, my daughter, you saved me. You saved me from an empty life. You saved me from loneliness. You saved me from forgetting what truly matters." As they drove back home, a real home with individual rooms for each child, a yard where they could play, and the security of never being hungry or cold again, Edward looked in the rearview mirror and saw his 3 children, Peter making the baby laugh, Luna telling an improvised story, and all united by the certainty that they would never be alone again. The rain had long stopped, but its fruits would continue to grow forever in the form of that improbable family that had been born from the most blessed accident of their lives.